morning. My name is Allan Marks of Boyden, and welcome to another edition in our micro podcast series on sustainability and renewable energy. Our guest today is Rob Wheal, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of APA Group. APA Group is one of Australia's leaders in the energy sector. They own and operate over $22 billion of gas, electricity, wind and solar assets across Australia. Rob Wheal is their CEO and Managing Director. He has over 25 years experience in Australia and internationally in energy and telecommunications. He joined APA in 2008, holding multiple roles before becoming CEO and Managing Director in 2019. Welcome, Rob. Nice to see you again. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Allan. And it's wonderful to be part of this podcast series.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking part. Our first question is, what are the game-changing shifts and opportunities arising across renewable energy?
Well, Allan, I think the first thing I would say is that there's no question that the energy transition is underway, and indeed it's accelerating, and that's happening globally, albeit that the pace of change is differing by region or by country, but the shift is undeniable if you look at all the data. And really what we're starting to see is that coal-fired generation is retiring, and that's particularly so if we look at our east coast here in Australia, in our national energy market, or the NEM. And we're starting to see that the world is looking to other forms of energy, in particular existing technologies like wind and solar. But wind and solar, as we know, the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time. And so it needs to be what we call in the industry firmed up, so that you've got a firm energy product. And clearly batteries and hydro are ways to do that, but those are still emerging, and gas generation or gas firming is certainly a big part of what we see into the future. In fact, when I look at the Bloomberg forecasts for generation capacity, that's electricity generation capacity by 2050, which is 3 decades from now, the forecasts are that generation capacity will be 3 times as much as what we see today. And that's, in part because the markets will grow, but more so because when we see 1 unit of coal come out, we always see 2 or 3 units of variable renewable energy coming in. And that's because wind and solar, as I mentioned earlier, it has a lower capacity factor given it's variable. But interestingly, when you look at the forecast in 2050, about 60% of that generation capacity, which, as I said earlier, is 3-fold increase, 60% is wind and solar. So that's if your questions around changing shifts and opportunities, that's 60% of our generation capacity globally will be wind and solar. Now, that's a significant investment required, there's no doubt. But importantly, and before I move on to investment opportunities to support that transition, gas, interestingly, is still 15%. Now, 15% may not sound so much, but actually, when you do the maths, it represents a near doubling in the generation capacity that gas generation provides today. So gas generation will certainly play its role, like I said, as part of that firming. And the other interesting forecast is not only will generation capacity be 3 times as much by 2050, but the annual spend or in capital spend in new electricity transmission networks will be about 3 times as much as what it is today. So in terms of emerging shifts, electrification is clearly one of those, and the investments that they're going to be required to support that are significant. And we see that as representing a significant opportunity for APA as a leading energy infrastructure business. Our chosen markets here in Australia and in the US, and we've identified in excess of $2.7 trillion of opportunities that we would focus on in those chosen markets across electricity transmission, the wind and solar, which I've talked about, the firming services that need to go with it, and gas pipelines to get the energy where it's needed. But all that theme is around the the electrification theme, which is a changing shift and certainly an opportunity here in Australia and globally. But the other interesting theme is around hydrogen, and we've seen a lot of talk and discussion and announcements and government support for hydrogen opportunities. We've sized that opportunity globally as around, and it's a big number, $11 trillion US.
Wow, that's massive.
That is an enormous, now whether the number's 100% right or not, but it represents a significant opportunity. And so it's a potential game changer. As much as electrification is an emerging shift, so is hydrogen. Now, there are still, despite it being a game changer, there's still some challenges around making it economic, particularly what we're calling in the industry green hydrogen, which is hydrogen effectively made through an electrolysis process in water. But there are other forms of generating hydrogen, as we know, using fossil fuels and sequestrating capturing the carbon. But I think Australia has a significant competitive advantage in the space. We have good renewable resources in wind and solar, as we know. We've got lots of land mass. We've got we're close to Asia, and we've got a network of pipelines that connect to our markets. So all up, I think that represents a significant opportunity for Australia. And interestingly, I mentioned the Bloomberg report earlier, but Frontier Economics also had a report recently, which is interesting in the context, because yes, there's the emerging theme of electrification, but the Frontier Economics report indicates that if you repurpose existing gas infrastructure, which is currently transporting natural gas around, and you repurpose it to be able to transport and deliver hydrogen as an energy, you can do that at half the cost than electrifying all the services that are currently provided by gas. And just to put that into context, in Victoria, which is the biggest gas consuming state here in Australia, in a peak winter day, and we're getting close to one of those, it's cold there today, the energy delivered by the gas system in Victoria is twice what the electricity system delivers. So that just gives you the sense of, if we wanted to go the full path of electrification of everything, we've got a big task ahead of us. But if we can repurpose infrastructure, and if hydrogen can play its role, then we can do that at a much more manageable cost to customers.
Yeah. You mentioned saying before about different initiatives around the world. I mean, in terms of what you're talking about for Australia, is that sort of region specific for Asia Pacific more broadly, or is that a separate question?
Yeah, well, look, just some comments there, Allan. I think as I said, Australia is blessed with land mass, sunshine, and wind resource. We could produce more renewable energy. We can produce more renewable energy than what we can consume. So the question is, how do you create a market for that? There is a project which is been put forward for investigation in the Northern Territory, which is about connecting through subsea electricity cables to Asia.
Wow.
And actually take that renewable there. Now, that's a pretty bold initiative, and I do think the economics are going to be challenged. But the other way, of course, of exporting renewable energy is through hydrogen.
Yes.
So if you can use the wind and the solar resource, and then somehow transport that energy, but if you can convert that energy into hydrogen energy and then be able to ship it, then and do so cost effectively, that represents an opportunity. And why is Asia important? Because big parts of Asia don't have the land mass, they don't have the sunshine or the resource, and so typically in the past they've been big consumers of liquid natural gas or LNG, and so it's quite possible that over time can translate across to an alternate fuel. But I did mention our chosen markets as APA. We're very much focused on Australia and North America. And North America, as you might imagine, it's the biggest industrial market, biggest consumer of energy. It'll go through a major transition. We see that as a market that will both embrace the electricity thematic as well as clean hydrogen, noting, of course, that it's one of the world's biggest producers and lowest cost producers of natural gas. So I think that'll continue to play a role into its future.
Yeah, thanks. It's most fascinating what's going on, and it sort of leads nicely into the next question, which is in the current environment. What have you observed, Rob, to be the main pivots, either for or against the development and wide scale usage of renewables?
Yeah, pivot's an interesting word. I might just comment on that first. We talk about an energy transition, but it when it starts to accelerate, it does feel a little bit like a pivot point. And I think the most obvious pivot, Allan, is the increased urgency that the world is now focused on to reduce carbon emissions and obviously minimize the impact of climate change. So that has been on a slow, let's call it a slow burn for some time, but there's no doubt that there's an increased urgency leading into the next global summit in Glasgow later this year. The Biden coming to presidency in the US is now another catalyst, and that urgency obviously leads to, as a catalyst, becomes a catalyst for investment in renewable energy. APA's invested over the years. We're now the number 8 owner and operator of renewable energy in Australia, and it plans to increase our position. So, I think from a pivot point, that urgency is a positive. It's a positive for Australia. It's a positive for the world. Now, what are the things that can work against that development of wide-scale use of renewable energy? Well, what we're seeing here, and it's probably not peculiar to Australia at all, is the lack of a stable policy framework, bipartisan support for a direction. It's been a challenge over the last decade, if not longer. It's become highly politicized. I think you could describe it as fractious at best. And what does that all mean? Well, in an environment where there's a lack of stable policy, it does disencourage investment, because you're not investing into an environment in which you know how it's going to play out into the number of the years ahead. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're starting to see a lot of intervention in the market. We're seeing the states, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria on the East Coast, all, if you like, going it alone, announcing their own plans around how they want to transition the economies to embrace more renewable generation and clean up their energy supplies. We've still got the federal government, if you like, intervening directly through its Snowy Hydro project, Snowy 2, but also announcing another gas generator to be government owned here in New South Wales, just north of Newcastle. So you've got these sorts of activities happening, which again stifle investment, because private sector will be looking at that and saying, well, there's a lack of policy certainty, there's state and federal governments intervening. Do we want to invest in that environment? And why is all that important? Is as you get more renewable energy coming in, as I mentioned earlier in my discussion, it is variable renewable energy, and so you need the stability that comes with firming, whether it be batteries or hydro or gas. So you need to create that environment of stability. So the market's just not set up for that, and rather than the states going it alone, which unfortunately is the direction they're headed, we really needed the National Energy Market, or the NEM as we call it on the East Coast, to set up a framework in which we can invest. Just one of the thoughts, we're seeing not only, if the questions, what are the pivots that could, both for and against development of wide-scale use. The other is the electricity system. It was always designed to come from, in New South Wales' case, no more than half a dozen big coal-fired generators, base load, 24/7, 365 days a year. And as we are introducing more variable renewable energy in locations clearly that aren't where these coal-fired stations were developed, we need to augment and build new electricity transmission to be able to cope with all that new renewable energy. So as much as the firming is important, the electricity system has got to be augmented. That takes capital. We need to create an environment that will encourage private sector capital. I think that's, whilst I'm talking about the things that could work against the development, these are opportunities. There are opportunities for a company like APA to invest in, and we stand willing to do so. But it is done so in an environment where there's less stable policy.
Yeah. No, thanks. It's a complex topic, isn't it? There's no doubt.
It certainly is, and it's moving fast. And
it's
an interesting example, Allan. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Callide Power Station, Queensland, and unfortunately had an incident which has meant it has had to shut down, and that's had quite a dramatic impact on the energy market. So it just shows how fragile the system can be when you take a chunk of capacity out of the market.
Yes. Rob, how is APA responding to the sort of evolution of ESG and the sort of regulatory issues, consumer values around sustainability? And has COVID in any way played a role in changing that focus in any way, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I would say, just in answer to that question, Allan, is that a strong position on, let's just call it ESG, because there's lots of different ways you can talk about this these days: corporate social responsibility, sustainability, etc. But a strong position in the space on ESG is a non-negotiable. And it might sound odd that I'm saying that, but if I think about a number of years ago when I'd be on an investor roadshow, I'd get a couple of questions on this topic, perhaps in Europe. Typically at the end of the meeting, they'd bring their sustainability person in, and these are investors, of course. And in Australia, I'd get the odd question, probably in the US less so. But that is all changed. There's now a real momentum. It's almost topic number one. And the expectation is that it's not, that you've got a strategy to talk to. And the question isn't, what are you doing in the space anymore? How do you measure up on some kind of sustainability index? It's more questions that go to how embedded is this in your strategy? And so what is, your question, what is APA doing to respond in this instance? Well, firstly, engaging with our stakeholders, whether it's investors, in community as a whole, and seeking their views. We've been evolving our approach, and one of the things that we found is, there's no hiding away from the fact that we're a large energy infrastructure business, but today 90% of what we do is in the natural gas space. And so what we've found is that, if you like, leaning in to that point, and being honest about our exposure to natural gas, but then talking about our commitment to a net zero 2050 ambition, talking about our focus on our strategy, which is around diversification. But at the same time, and when I say diversification, investing further in some of those thematics that I talked about earlier, electrification and hydrogen and clean fuels. But at the same time, still and hopefully my message is clear, that gas will continue to play an important role in our mix. There's no question. And in Australia, it's 26% of our primary energy usage. It's 20% of our electricity generation. So accepting that's where we're at, but then being honest about how do we decarbonize and transition our business. So that's we're finding that is what investors want to know. That's what our stakeholders want to know, and really comes then down to about execution. And you can talk as much as you can, but they want to see evidence of what are you doing in that space. We've said that we've committed to a net zero 2050 ambition, but we're going to hold ourselves accountable to interim targets that guide us towards that journey, and we'll be announcing those interim targets along with our climate management plan framework during the course of the next 12 months.
I should look forward to looking at that.
Yeah. Look, I think you asked a question around COVID. Just to quickly touch on that, Allan. look, there's no question that at the, I'm winding the clock back a little over 12 months for all of us, that when the pandemic first kicked off and we were all staring into an unknown, that I think it's fair to say that it is a general comment that there would have been a bit of a pause in the space, not a long pause on the ESG space, but just as you would expect, a real focus on, looking at how to manage our business in what was a big period of uncertainty, and that would be the same for every business. But I really do call it as a very short pause, because no sooner had we'd embraced what we needed to do as an industry, as a business, to manage COVID and to manage the impact on our people and our customers, that the focus was back on around decarbonisation. And I think and I mentioned it earlier, but Biden's presidency in the US, I think, was another catalyst for investors wanting to embrace that change.
Thanks, Rob. That's really interesting, particularly your comments about the US election having that impact. But if we could move on to perhaps the last question, and that is, what are the most important behavioural changes organisations and consumers will need to implement in order to have them?
Yes, Allan. Well, I think the first thing is that there's no doubt that the pace of change right now is accelerated. It's accelerating exponentially. And I say that not just in the context of the energy sector, although it is more acute in the sector where there's an enormous amount of change. And so what does all that mean? What does it mean when there's a high rate of change? Well, I think what it means from a behavioural change perspective, that as organisations, as businesses, as just members of the community, we need to adopt an innovation mindset. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think we need to continually be asking, is there a better way to do something? And so if we look back at last year, when COVID almost overnight came along and it transformed how we do things, businesses scaled up their technology, we found new ways of working. And so I think we've got that in our DNA. We know how to be innovative. And there's no sign of that change letting up. So we've proven we can take on those big challenges. I think we need to really embrace the same attributes that we undertook during that first part of COVID and ongoing, where we were nimble, we're courageous, we collaborated well, and we saw that bipartisan support. We saw that across states. So I think we've got that DNA. We need to continue to embrace the innovative mindset to tackle the big challenges that our society faces, and obviously sustainability is one of those big changes. And from an APA perspective, we're doing that. We've established what we're calling our Pathfinder program, which is all about being innovative and identifying those energy solutions of tomorrow. So I think innovation and that innovation mindset's important from a behavioural change. The other one, which I think is particularly important now, is how we impact upon communities and being more impactful in a positive way. And I think that was highlighted in obviously a big way with the Juukan Gorge incident of last year. And so doing the right thing, responding to our stakeholders, engaging with our stakeholders, it's key to our social license. And it's not just about projects like a mining project, but even the establishment of more renewable energy projects needs to have social license. The establishment and development of the transmission links that'll bring that renewable energy into where the markets are. All of that applies just equally to any forms of development, engaging with our communities. And it's one of the reasons we, as APA, we've just recently established a stakeholder advisory panel. And it's got representatives from business, from the charitable sector, native title councils, energy councils, really being a sounding board to us as we think about how we engage with communities. And off the back of that, we've got dedicated stakeholder forums for particular projects. So I think, and that's in fact setting this up is an innovation mindset. It's thinking about how we need to do things differently for the benefit of the communities in which we operate.
There's some great initiatives there, Rob. Thank you. And that really concludes our mini podcast. And I just want to take a moment just to offer Boyden sincere thanks for you taking part and sharing some wonderful thoughts and insights and ideas. And thank you for joining us, Rob Wheal.
Oh, it's a real pleasure, Alan. Happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.